The stagecoach driver's words hit Grace Norton like a physical blow. "No money, no ride, miss, and that's final." Grace stood in the dusty street of Montrose, Colorado, watching her only means of escape prepare to leave without her. The September sun beat down mercilessly on her threadbare dress, and she clutched her single carpetbag tighter, as though it might offer some protection against the reality of her situation. Behind her, somewhere in one of those ramshackle buildings, her former employer was probably already celebrating his decision to withhold her final month's wages after she'd refused his unwanted advances. She had 23 cents to her name, no family within 1,000 miles, and winter was coming to the Rocky Mountains. "Please," she said, hating the desperation in her voice. "I can pay you when I reach Denver. I have an aunt there who will help me." The driver spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Heard that one before. Step aside, miss." Grace's throat tightened. She had walked away from her position as a governess with nothing but her dignity intact, and now even that felt like a foolish luxury. The alternative had been to submit to Marcus Henley's groping hands and leering suggestions, and she'd rather starve than endure another moment under his roof. But standing here in the September heat of 1883, starvation seemed like a very real possibility. "How much is her passage?" The voice came from behind her, deep and measured. Grace turned to see a man leading a magnificent chestnut horse toward them. He was tall, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that needed a trim, wearing dusty work clothes that had seen better days but were clean and well-maintained. His face was weathered in the way of men who spent their lives outdoors, with fine lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though he wasn't smiling now. Those eyes, a striking gray-blue, fixed on the driver with quiet intensity. $15 to Denver, the driver said, suddenly more respectful. The stranger pulled a worn leather wallet from his pocket and counted out the bills without hesitation. "Here's 20. Make sure she gets a decent seat and stops for proper meals." Grace found her voice. "I cannot accept this. I do not even know you." He finally looked at her directly, and she felt something shift in her chest at the kindness in his expression. "Frank Oliver, madam. I own the 00 Ranch about 10 miles outside town, and you look like someone who needs help. Grace Norton." She drew herself up straighter, trying to maintain some dignity. "I appreciate your generosity, Mr. Oliver, but I have no way to repay you. Did not ask you to." He handed the money to the driver, who pocketed it quickly. "When's this stage leaving?" 20 minutes, the driver said. "We are just waiting on 2 more passengers." Frank turned back to Grace. "You running from something or towards something?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. "Away from a difficult situation. Toward, I hope, a better one." He nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Denver's a rough town for a woman alone. You have people there. An aunt. At least, I had an aunt there 3 years ago when she last wrote. Margaret Nelson on Larimer Street." Something flickered across his face. Larimer Street's changed a lot in 3 years. Not the safest area anymore. He was quiet for a moment, studying her with those perceptive eyes. "I was planning to head back to the ranch today, but I have business in Denver that I have been putting off." "Reckon I could ride along. Make sure you get where you are going safely." Grace's first instinct was to refuse. She had already accepted too much charity from this stranger, but practicality warred with pride. She knew nothing about Denver, and if her aunt had moved or, God forbid, passed away, she would be alone in an unfamiliar city with no money and no prospects. "Why would you do this?" she asked. "You do not know anything about me." "I know you would rather stand in the street with your last pennies than compromise yourself. I know you are scared but trying not to show it, and I know what it's like to need help and have no one offer it." He adjusted his hat, looking almost uncomfortable with his own admission. My mother was stranded once, long time ago. A stranger helped her when no one else would. Figure I owe the world a debt for that kindness. The stagecoach driver cleared his throat. We are leaving in 15 minutes with or without you, miss. Grace looked at Frank Oliver, trying to read his intentions. His face was open, honest, with none of the sly calculation she'd seen in Marcus Henley's expression. His clothes were worn but good quality, his horse well cared for, his manner respectful. Everything about him suggested a man of integrity, but she'd been wrong about people before. I would be grateful for your company on the journey, she said finally. Thank you, Mr. Oliver. Frank, he corrected. If we are going to be traveling together for the next few days, might as well dispense with formalities. He glanced at the sun's position. I need to send a telegram to my foreman, let him know I will be gone longer than planned. Will you be all right here for a few minutes? I will be fine. She watched him walk toward the telegraph office, leading his horse with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. Grace had been raised to be suspicious of kindness from strange men. Her mother, God rest her soul, had warned her that men always wanted something in return. But sometimes, her father had countered, people were simply good. She hoped Frank Oliver was one of those rare, genuinely good people, because right now she had no choice but to trust him. The other passengers arrived. A traveling salesman with a case full of patent medicines and a stern-looking woman in widow's weeds who introduced herself as Mrs. Beatrice Palmer. The widow gave Grace's shabby dress a disapproving look, but said nothing. Grace climbed into the stagecoach and took a seat by the window. Grateful for the $5 in meal money the driver had given her as change from Frank's $20. Frank returned just as the driver was checking the rigging one last time. Got a fresh horse from the livery, he said, swinging into the saddle of a sturdy bay. My other horse will be sent back to the ranch. Ready when you are. The stage lurched into motion, and Grace gripped the edge of her seat as they rolled out of Montrose. Through the window, she watched the town recede into the distance, taking with it the last 6 months of her life. She had come to Colorado with such hope, answering an advertisement for a governess position with excellent references from her previous employer in St. Louis. The reality had been far different from the promise. Marcus Henley had been a widower, certainly, with 2 young children who needed education and guidance, but his interest in Grace had been anything but proper. She'd endured 3 months of increasingly bold advances before the situation had become untenable. When she'd finally confronted him and announced her intention to leave, he'd responded by dismissing her without the wages she was owed, claiming she'd failed in her duties. She had no legal recourse. A woman's word against a wealthy man's was worth nothing in a court of law. The stagecoach hit a rut, jolting her back to the present. Through the window, she could see Frank riding alongside, his posture relaxed but alert. He caught her looking and touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. Despite her circumstances, Grace felt a small flutter of something that wasn't quite hope, but was close enough to sustain her. Mrs. Palmer proved to be a talker. Within the first hour, Grace learned that the widow was traveling to Denver to live with her sister after her husband's death from pneumonia 6 months prior. The salesman, Mr. Whitmore, was equally verbose, extolling the virtues of his various elixirs and tonics until Mrs. Palmer told him sharply that if she wanted snake oil, she'd milk a snake herself. They stopped at noon at a way station, a rough building that served barely edible stew and hard bread. Frank helped Grace down from the coach, his hand steady under her elbow. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "Well enough. Mrs. Palmer has been quite informative about the various ailments that afflicted her late husband. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Sounds riveting. It has made the time pass. She hesitated. I have been thinking about Denver. If my aunt has moved or if she cannot take me in, I will need to find employment quickly. Do you know the city well? Well enough. I sell cattle there twice a year and have a few contacts. If it comes to that, I might be able to help you find something suitable. You have already done so much. Have not done anything yet except buy you a ticket. He studied her face. You look tired. Try to rest this afternoon if you can. It's a long journey and you will need your strength. They ate their meal in relative silence. Grace noticed that Frank had ordered her the better cut of meat and fresh bread instead of the hard tack, paying the difference without comment. It was a small kindness, but after months of Marcus Henley's calculated cruelty, such genuine consideration moved her more than she cared to admit. The afternoon stretched long and hot. Grace tried to doze as Frank had suggested, but the constant jolting of the coach and Mrs. Palmer's endless chatter made rest impossible. She found herself watching Frank through the window instead. He rode with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle, occasionally dropping back to talk to the driver or riding ahead to scout the road. Once, she saw him water his horse at a stream, and the gentle way he handled the animal spoke volumes about his character. They stopped again as the sun began its descent toward the mountains. This way station was larger, with actual beds available for rent. Frank appeared at the coach door before Grace could gather her bag. I have arranged for you to have a room tonight, he said. It's not fancy, but it's clean and private. Mrs. Palmer will be sharing with you. Grace's pride warred with exhaustion and lost. Thank you. The room was indeed small and plain, with 2 narrow beds and a washstand, but after sleeping in a cramped attic room at the Henley house, it seemed like luxury. Mrs. Palmer immediately claimed the bed nearest the window and launched into another monologue about her various ailments. Grace washed her face and hands, changed into her only other dress, and excused herself to find some peace. Frank was outside, tending to his horse. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, and the air had turned pleasantly cool. Escaped Mrs. Palmer. He asked without looking up from checking his horse's hooves. Is it that obvious? She has been talking non-stop since Montrose. A man could hear her from 100 yards away. He straightened, brushing off his hands. There's a decent view from that ridge over there. Want to stretch your legs? They walked in comfortable silence to a small rise that overlooked the valley below. The landscape was breathtaking, all mountains and sky painted in the colors of sunset. How long have you had the ranch? Grace asked. 8 years. My father left it to me when he passed. It was not much then, just a few hundred acres and more debt than cattle. Took some time to turn it around. You did it alone. Had a good foreman and a few loyal hands. We made it work. He glanced at her. What about you? How did you end up in Montrose? Grace told him, leaving out the worst details of Marcus Henley's behavior but making it clear why she'd left without her wages. Frank's jaw tightened as she spoke. Man like that should be horsewhipped, he said quietly. You did the right thing leaving. The right thing has left me penniless. You are alive and free. That counts for something. They stood together as the sun sank below the mountains, and Grace felt a strange sense of peace despite her uncertain future. There was something solid about Frank Oliver, something trustworthy. He did not try to fill the silence with empty words or make promises he could not keep. He simply stood beside her, a quiet presence in the gathering darkness. We should head back, he said finally. Early start tomorrow. That night, despite Mrs. Palmer's snoring, Grace slept better than she had in months. The second day of travel began with rain. It started as a light drizzle but quickly turned into a steady downpour that turned the road into a river of mud. The stagecoach struggled through the mire, occasionally sliding sideways in a way that made Grace's heart leap into her throat. Through the rain-streaked window, she could barely see Frank, but he was there, riding through the storm as though it were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. By noon, the driver admitted they were making poor time and would need to spend an extra night on the road. They stopped at a small settlement that was barely more than a few buildings clustered around a trading post. There were no separate rooms available, only a common room where travelers could sleep on the floor. Frank found her huddled under the trading post's awning, watching the rain. "Not ideal accommodations," he said, water dripping from his hat. "I have slept in worse places." "Have you?" She thought of the cramped attic room, the thin blanket, the leaking roof. "Yes," he studied her for a long moment. "The trading post owner owes me a favor. There's a storage room in back with a cot. It's yours if you want it." "What about you?" "I will sleep in the stable with my horse." "Would not be the first time." "Frank, you cannot keep doing this." "Doing what?" "Taking care of me. I am not your responsibility." He removed his hat and ran a hand through his wet hair. "I know you are not. But that does not mean I am going to let you sleep on a floor with a bunch of strangers when there's a better option available." His voice was gentle but firm. "Grace, I am not keeping a tally of favors owed. I am just trying to help someone who needs it. Can you let me do that?" She wanted to argue, to maintain her independence and dignity, but she was tired and worried and more grateful than she could express. "Thank you." The storage room was cramped and smelled of dried herbs and leather, but the cot was comfortable and, more importantly, private. Grace changed into dry clothes and tried to sleep, but her mind kept returning to the man sleeping in the stable. Frank Oliver was unlike any man she'd ever known. There was no agenda to his kindness, no expectation of repayment. He helped because it was the right thing to do, because someone had once helped his mother. The rain continued through the night and into the next morning. The driver announced that the road ahead was likely washed out and they might be stuck for another day. The other passengers grumbled, but Grace felt a strange sense of contentment. This limbo between her past and an uncertain future felt oddly peaceful. She found Frank in the stable, grooming his horse. The steady rhythm of the brush against the animal's coat was soothing. "Mind if I watch?" She asked from the doorway. "Come on in. You know anything about horses?" "A little. My father kept a carriage horse when I was young." He handed her a brush. "Want to help?" They worked in companionable silence, the rain drumming on the roof above them. The horse, a gentle mare named Bess, turned her head to nuzzle Grace's shoulder. "She likes you," Frank said. "How can you tell?" "Bess is particular about people. She only nuzzles folks she trusts." Grace stroked the horse's neck, feeling the warmth of the animal's trust. It had been so long since anyone or anything had trusted her unconditionally. "Tell me about your ranch," she said. Frank's face brightened. "It's beautiful country. High valley with a creek running through it, mountains on 3 sides. We run about 2,000 head of cattle now, mostly Herefords. Have a good crew, men I would trust with my life. The house is nothing fancy, but it's solid and comfortable. You live there alone. Just me and my foreman, Tom. He has a room in the bunkhouse but takes most meals at the main house. Gets lonely sometimes, but the work keeps me busy." Grace could hear the unspoken words beneath his description. He had built something substantial, created a life of purpose and productivity, but it was a solitary life. She understood that loneliness. Despite being surrounded by people in the Henley household, she'd never felt more alone. "What will you do in Denver?" she asked. "Need to meet with some buyers, arrange contracts for next season. Boring business stuff mostly. What about you?" "What will you do if you find your aunt?" I suppose that depends on her circumstances. I would like to find another position as a governess or teacher. I have a good education and excellent references from my previous employers. Well, most of them. You are good with children. I love children. Teaching them, watching them learn and grow, it's the most rewarding work I have ever done. She paused. The Henley children were sweet. It broke my heart to leave them, but I could not stay. They were lucky to have you, even for a short time. The rain finally stopped late that afternoon, and the driver announced they would leave at first light. Grace spent the evening helping the trading post owner's wife prepare supper for the travelers, grateful for something useful to do. Frank joined them for the meal, sitting across from her at the long table. Mr. Whitmore, the salesman, had produced a bottle of whiskey and was becoming increasingly garrulous. "You two make a handsome couple," he announced, gesturing with his glass. "How long have you been married?" "We are not married," Grace said quickly, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "Not married. Traveling together unchaperoned." Mrs. Palmer's voice was sharp with disapproval. "That is highly improper." "I am escorting Miss Norton to Denver as a kindness," Frank said, his voice level but edged with steel. "There is nothing improper about helping someone in need." "Still, appearances matter," Mrs. Palmer sniffed. "People will talk." "Then let them talk," Grace said, surprising herself with her vehemence. "I would rather endure gossip than the alternative Mr. Oliver saved me from." Mrs. Palmer had the grace to look somewhat abashed, and the conversation moved on to safer topics. But later, lying on her cot in the storage room, Grace thought about the widow's words. She'd spent her whole life worrying about appearances, about maintaining respectability and reputation. Where had it gotten her? Stranded and penniless, dependent on the charity of a stranger. Yet Frank Oliver was no longer quite a stranger, was he? In the space of 3 days, he'd become something more. Not quite a friend, but certainly more than an acquaintance. He made her feel safe in a way she hadn't felt in years, perhaps ever. The 4th day dawned clear and bright. The road had dried enough to travel, though the going was slow through the muddy patches. They made better time than the previous days, stopping only briefly for meals. Frank rode ahead more often, scouting the road and ensuring the way was passable. Late in the afternoon, they crested a rise, and Denver spread out before them in the valley below. Grace's breath caught. It was larger than she'd imagined, a sprawling collection of buildings and streets that seemed to stretch for miles. Somewhere down there was her Aunt Margaret, assuming she was still alive and still living on Larimer Street. And if she was not, Grace pushed the thought away. She would face that problem if it arose. They reached the city as the sun was setting, the stage rolling down streets that grew increasingly busy and rough. Denver in 1883 was a city of contrasts, with elegant mansions on some streets and ramshackle shanties on others. Larimer Street, when they finally reached it, proved to be one of the less elegant areas, with saloons and boarding houses crowding together in a cacophony of noise and activity. The stage stopped at the depot, and Frank was there immediately to help her down. "Where on Larimer Street?" "Number 42. That is about 6 blocks from here. I will walk you." Grace gathered her carpetbag and said goodbye to Mrs. Palmer and Mr. Whitmore, then followed Frank into the crowded street. The noise was overwhelming after days of relative quiet, and the smell of unwashed humanity, horse manure and coal smoke made her eyes water. Frank stayed close, his presence a shield against the jostling crowd. They found number 42, a narrow boarding house squeezed between a saloon and a laundry. The paint was peeling and the windows were grimy, but there was a neat row of flower boxes on the sills, suggesting someone cared about the place. Grace knocked on the door. It was opened by a young woman with tired eyes and a baby on her hip. "I am looking for Margaret Nelson," Grace said. "I am her niece, Grace." The woman's expression softened. "Oh, honey, I am sorry. Mrs. Nelson passed away last winter. Pneumonia took her quick." The world tilted sideways. Grace felt Frank's hand steady her elbow, anchoring her to reality. "I see," she managed. "Thank you for telling me. Are you all right?" the woman asked, concern creasing her forehead. "You look pale as milk." "I will be fine, thank you." They walked back toward the main street in silence. Grace's mind was racing, trying to formulate a plan, any plan for what came next. She had no money, no family, no prospects. Frank had already done so much for her. She could not ask for more. "There's a boarding house I know on the other side of town," Frank said quietly. "Respectable place, run by a widow named Mrs. Harris. She might have work for you, or at least a room while you figure things out." "I cannot pay for a room. I can." "Frank, no. You have already spent so much on me. I cannot accept more charity." He stopped walking and turned to face her. The street lamps cast his face in shadow and light, and his expression was intense. "Grace, listen to me. You are not alone in this. I know we have only known each other a few days, but I am not going to abandon you in a strange city with nothing. Let me help you, please." His words broke something loose in her chest, and she felt tears threatening for the first time since leaving Montrose. She'd been so strong, so determined to maintain her composure, but his kindness was undoing her carefully constructed walls. "Why?" she whispered. "Why do you care what happens to me?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Because I have been alone and I know how heavy that weight can be. Because you deserve better than what life has handed you. And because, if I am being honest, I have come to care about what happens to you." The admission hung in the air between them, fragile and precious. "I care about what happens to you too," Grace said softly. Something shifted in Frank's expression, a warmth that had nothing to do with the street lamp's glow. "Then let me take care of you for a little while longer. Just until you get your feet under you." Mrs. Harris's boarding house was indeed respectable, a neat two-story building on a quiet street. The widow herself was a brisk, no-nonsense woman in her 50s who looked Grace up and down with sharp eyes. "I need someone to help with cooking and cleaning," she said after Frank explained the situation. "Room and board plus $3 a week. You work hard, keep your nose clean, and we will get along fine. You cause trouble, you are out." "Deal, deal," Grace said, relief flooding through her. Mrs. Harris showed her to a small but clean room on the second floor. It had a bed, a dresser, a washstand, and a window that looked out over a small garden. After the storage room and the cramped attic at the Henley house, it seemed like paradise. Frank helped carry her bag upstairs. At the door to her room, he paused. "I am staying at the Windsor Hotel while I conduct my business. It will take me 3 or 4 days. May I call on you? I would like that." He smiled, and Grace realized it was the first genuine, full smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his face, making him look younger and somehow more vulnerable. "Get some rest," he said. "You have had a rough few days." After he left, Grace sat on the edge of her bed and let herself cry. She cried for her lost aunt, for the uncertainty of her future, for the relief of having a safe place to stay. But mostly, she cried because for the first time in longer than she could remember, someone had shown her genuine kindness without expectation of anything in return. The next morning, Mrs. Harris put her to work immediately. Grace scrubbed floors, washed linens, helped prepare meals for the dozen or so boarders who lived in the house. The work was hard but honest, and she threw herself into it with determination. At least here, she was earning her keep. Frank appeared at the door that evening just as Grace was finishing the dinner dishes. Mrs. Harris answered his knock and called Grace to the parlor with a knowing look. "Mr. Oliver," Grace said, suddenly conscious of her damp dress and disheveled hair. "I was not expecting you. I brought you something." He handed her a package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a dress, simple but well made in a deep blue fabric, along with a warm shawl and a pair of gloves. "Frank, I cannot accept this. Before you argue, let me explain. I was meeting with one of my buyers today, and his wife runs a dress shop. She had some items she was selling at cost, and I thought you might need something warm. Winter comes early in Denver. It was a practical gift, and the way he presented it made refusal difficult." The dress was beautiful, far nicer than anything Grace had owned in years. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for this and for everything. I do not know how I will ever repay you." "Have dinner with me tomorrow night. That is repayment enough." Grace smiled. "That hardly seems fair." "Let me worry about what is fair." He glanced at Mrs. Harris, who was pretending to read a newspaper but was clearly listening to every word. "There is a decent restaurant 2 blocks over. Nothing fancy, but the food is good. Would 7 o'clock suit you?" 7 o'clock would be perfect. After he left, Mrs. Harris lowered her newspaper and fixed Grace with a shrewd look. "That man is courting you, you know. We barely know each other. Sometimes that is when you know best, before all the complications set in." She folded her paper with decisive movements. "He is a good man, I can tell. Respectful, generous, and the way he looks at you could melt butter. You could do a lot worse." Grace touched the dress, feeling the quality of the fabric. "I am not looking to be courted. I am trying to rebuild my life." Sometimes those two things are not mutually exclusive. Mrs. Harris stood, her expression softening. "I know you have been hurt, girl. I can see it in your eyes. But do not let past pain keep you from future happiness. That is no way to live." That night, Grace tried on the new dress. It fit perfectly, skimming her figure without being immodest, the color bringing out the warmth in her brown eyes. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the dresser and barely recognized the woman looking back. For the first time in months, she looked like someone with hope. The next day dragged interminably. Grace threw herself into her work, scrubbing and cooking with more energy than necessary. Mrs. Harris watched with amusement but said nothing. Finally, evening arrived, and Grace changed into her new dress, arranging her hair as best she could with her limited supplies. Frank arrived precisely at 7, wearing a clean shirt and jacket that made him look almost citified, though the calluses on his hands and the sun lines around his eyes marked him as a man of the outdoors. "You look beautiful," he said simply. The restaurant was modest but clean, with red checked tablecloths and candles on each table. Frank ordered them both steaks with potatoes and vegetables, and they ate slowly, talking about everything and nothing. Grace told him about her childhood in Missouri, her parents' deaths from cholera when she was 17, her decision to become a governess rather than marry the shopkeeper's son her aunt had tried to match her with. Frank talked about the ranch, about the satisfaction of building something with his own hands, about his dreams of expanding the herd and maybe one day breeding horses as well as cattle. He talked about his father, who'd been stern but fair, and his mother, who died when he was 12. "She was stranded once," he said, echoing what he'd told Grace back in Montrose. "Before she married my father, she was traveling west with her family when they were attacked by bandits. Everyone was killed except her. She made it to a small town with nothing but the clothes on her back. A rancher took her in, gave her work. Eventually she met my father and they married, but she never forgot that kindness. She always said that one act of charity saved her life in every way that mattered." "Is that why you helped me?" Grace asked softly, partly, but also because I wanted to. "Because the moment I saw you standing in that street, looking so fierce and scared and determined, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. He reached across the table and took her hand. I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Grace's heart was pounding. Frank, we have only known each other 5 days. I know. And if this is too much, too fast, tell me and I will back away. But I would rather be honest about what I am feeling than waste time pretending otherwise. His thumb stroked the back of her hand, the touch sending warmth up her arm. I think you are remarkable, Grace Norton. I think you are brave and strong and kind. And I would like very much to keep getting to know you, if you will let me. She looked at their joined hands, at his weathered fingers intertwined with her smaller ones. Everything in her upbringing told her to be cautious, to guard her heart, to remember that men were not to be trusted. But Frank Oliver had done nothing but prove himself trustworthy from the moment they met. I would like that too, she said. His smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. They walked back to the boarding house slowly, neither wanting the evening to end. At the door, Frank took both her hands in his. I have 2 more days of business in Denver, he said. May I see you again tomorrow? Yes. He lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, the gesture old-fashioned and achingly romantic. Good night, Grace. Good night, Frank. Mrs. Harris was waiting in the parlor when Grace came in. Well, Grace could not stop smiling. Well, what? Do not play coy with me, girl. How was your evening? It was wonderful. I knew it. Mrs. Harris looked pleased with herself. That man is smitten with you, and you are just as smitten with him even if you are too stubborn to admit it yet. Grace sank into a chair, her mind whirling. It is happening so fast. Is that wrong? Love does not follow a schedule, dear. Sometimes it creeps up slow and sometimes it hits you like lightning. Neither way is better or worse, just different. She studied Grace's face. What are you afraid of? That I am being foolish. That I am seeing what I want to see because I am desperate for security. That this will turn out like every other situation where I trusted someone and was betrayed. Those are reasonable fears. But let me ask you this. When you are with him, do you feel pressured? Does he make demands? Does he try to control or manipulate you? Grace thought about it honestly. No, he asks, he offers, but he never demands. He respects my choices. Then trust yourself. Trust what you are feeling. And if it turns out you are wrong, well, at least you will have tried. Better that than spending your life wondering what might have been. The next day, Frank took her to a museum, then to a park where children played and couples strolled. They talked for hours, discovering shared opinions on books and music, debating politics and philosophy. Grace learned that Frank was remarkably well-read for a rancher, his mother having insisted on education despite their isolated location. He learned that Grace had a wicked sense of humor beneath her proper exterior, and that she could discuss cattle breeding with surprising knowledge, thanks to her rural upbringing. That evening, they dined at a slightly fancier restaurant, and afterward, Frank walked her through the city as the street lamps flickered to life. I need to head back to the ranch tomorrow, he said as they approached the boarding house. I have been gone longer than I planned, and Tom will be wondering if I have been eaten by a bear. Grace's heart sank. She'd known this was coming, but she was not ready for it. Of course, you have responsibilities. Come with me. She stopped walking. What? Come to the ranch? Not as a permanent thing, just for a visit. A week, maybe 2. See the place, meet Tom and the hands. If you hate it, I will bring you back to Denver with no hard feelings. But I would like you to see the life I have built. I would like you to be part of it if you are willing. Frank, that is incredibly improper. I cannot just go live with you unchaperoned. Tom's sister, Maria, lives on the property. She does cooking and laundry for the crew. She could chaperone, make sure everything is proper. He took her hands. Grace, I know this is fast. I know we have only known each other a week, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I want to court you properly. I want to show you the world I am offering, and I want you to have all the information before you make any decisions about your future." Grace's mind raced. It was impulsive, improper, and potentially dangerous to her reputation. It was also exactly what she wanted to do. "What about my position here? Mrs. Harris likes you, but she had help before you and she will have help after you. I suspect she will understand if you need to explore your options." "You have already talked to her." He had the grace to look sheepish. "I might have mentioned the possibility when I stopped by this afternoon. She said she thought it was a fine idea and that you should see something of the country before settling down." Grace should have been annoyed at his presumption, but instead she felt a bubble of laughter rise in her chest. "You are very sure of yourself, Frank Oliver." "Not sure at all. Hopeful, maybe. Determined to try my best to convince you to give me a chance, certainly." His expression turned serious. "I care about you, Grace, more than I thought possible in such a short time. I want to see where this could go, and I think you do too. Am I wrong?" "No," she whispered. "You are not wrong." "Then come with me. Let me show you the ranch, the mountains, the life we could build together. If at any point you want to leave, I will bring you back immediately, no questions asked. You have my word." Grace looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. A week ago, she had been standing in Montrose with no money and no hope, and now this man was offering her a glimpse of a future she'd never imagined. "I will come," she said, "for a visit, to see the ranch and consider my options." His smile was incandescent. "That is all I ask, Mrs. Harris was indeed understanding when Grace explained the situation the next morning. "I knew you would not be staying long," she said. "You have that look about you, like you are meant for something bigger than washing dishes in a boarding house. Go on, see what life has to offer. If it does not work out, you can always come back. I will keep your position open for a month." Frank arrived mid-morning with a gentle mare for Grace to ride. "Her name is Clover," he said, helping Grace into the saddle. "She is steady and reliable, perfect for a long journey." They rode out of Denver as the sun climbed higher, leaving behind the noise and crowds for the open country beyond. The air was crisp and clean, scented with pine and sage. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already dusted with snow. Grace had ridden before, but not for several years, and her muscles quickly reminded her of that fact. Frank kept the pace easy, stopping frequently to rest the horses and let Grace stretch. "How far is the ranch?" she asked during one of these stops. "About 60 miles. We will stop overnight at a friend's place, then arrive at the ranch tomorrow afternoon. You have friends along the way. Charlie Henderson and I served together in the Army, back before I settled down to ranching. He has a small spread about halfway between Denver and my place. His wife Martha makes the best biscuits you have ever tasted." The ride was beautiful, following a river valley that wound between forested hills. Frank pointed out landmarks and wildlife, his love for the land evident in every word. They saw deer, a fox, and once in the distance, a small herd of elk. As they rode, they talked. Grace told him about her dreams of maybe one day opening a school for girls, about her love of literature and music. Frank shared his hopes of expanding the ranch, of breeding quality horses, of building something that would last beyond his lifetime. "You want children?" Grace asked, then immediately blushed. "I am sorry, that is too personal." "No, it is a fair question if we are considering a future together." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes, I do. I always imagined having a big family, lots of kids running around the ranch. What about you?" "I have always wanted children. Working as a governess let me experience some of that, but it is not the same as having your own." "No, I imagine it is not." They reached the Henderson place as the sun was setting. It was a modest ranch, smaller than Frank's but well-maintained, with a neat house and barn. Charlie Henderson turned out to be a bear of a man with a booming laugh, and his wife Martha was plump and welcoming, immediately taking Grace under her wing. Frank wrote to say he was bringing a guest, Martha said, leading Grace to a guest room while the men tended to the horses. I am so pleased to meet you. Frank is like family to us, and we have been hoping he would find someone special. We have only just met, Grace protested. Honey, sometimes that is all it takes. I knew Charlie was the one for me within a week of meeting him. We have been married 15 years now, and I have never regretted a moment. She smiled knowingly. Frank is a good man, one of the best. If he has chosen you, then you must be something special yourself. Dinner was a lively affair, with Charlie and Frank swapping stories of their army days, while Martha and Grace discussed everything from preserving vegetables to the latest fashions from back east. Grace felt herself relaxing, laughing more freely than she had in months. After dinner, Frank asked if she wanted to see the stars away from the lamplight. They walked to a small hill behind the house, and Grace gasped at the sight above them. The sky was ablaze with stars, more than she'd ever seen, the Milky Way a river of light across the darkness. It is even better at the ranch, Frank said softly. No towns nearby, no lights, just you and the universe. They stood in comfortable silence, and gradually Frank's hand found hers. The simple touch sent warmth through her entire body. Grace, I need to tell you something. The seriousness in his tone made her turn to face him. I am falling in love with you, he said simply. I know it is too soon to say that. I know we barely know each other. But I have never felt this way about anyone, and I would rather be honest than try to hide what I am feeling. Grace's breath caught. Every rational part of her brain told her to be cautious, to guard her heart, to remember that she'd known this man barely a week. But her heart, that treacherous organ, was already ahead of her brain. I am falling in love with you too, she whispered. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle. May I kiss you? She nodded, and he lowered his head slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. When his lips met hers, it was tender and sweet, a promise of more to come. Grace melted into the kiss, her hands coming up to rest on his chest where she could feel the steady beat of his heart. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. That was my first kiss, Grace admitted. I am honored. He rested his forehead against hers. And if I have my way, I will be the only man who ever kisses you. They stood together under the stars, holding each other, neither wanting to break the spell of the moment. Finally, practical considerations intruded, and they reluctantly headed back to the house. Martha took one look at Grace's face and smiled knowingly, but said nothing. That night, Grace lay in the comfortable guest bed, touching her lips where Frank had kissed her. Her life had changed so dramatically in such a short time, and she felt like she was standing on the edge of something momentous. They left early the next morning after a breakfast of Martha's famous biscuits. Charlie pulled Frank aside for a private word, and Grace saw Frank nod seriously before they clasped hands. Then they were riding again, following a trail that climbed into higher country. The landscape grew more dramatic as they traveled, with towering pines and rocky outcroppings. They stopped for lunch beside a waterfall, and Frank pointed out the boundaries of his land. We are on the ranch now, he said. Still about 2 hours to the house, but everything you can see in that direction is 00 land. Grace looked at the vast expanse of forest and meadow, trying to comprehend the scope of what he had built. It is magnificent. Wait until you see the house and the valley. They continued on, and finally crested a rise that looked down into a high valley. Below, a creek meandered through grassland dotted with cattle. Buildings clustered together near the creek, A main house, barn, bunkhouse, and several outbuildings. Mountains rose on three sides, creating a natural amphitheater of breathtaking beauty. "Welcome to the Double O," Frank said, pride evident in his voice. As they rode down into the valley, several men emerged from the barn. Frank waved and they waved back, clearly curious about the woman with their boss. Tom, the foreman, proved to be a weathered man in his 50s with kind eyes and a firm handshake. "Miss Norton, good to meet you. Frank sent word you would be coming. My sister Maria has the guest room all ready for you." Maria was a handsome woman in her 40s with dark hair streaked with gray and a no-nonsense manner. She welcomed Grace warmly and immediately took charge, showing her to a comfortable room in the main house with views of the valley. "You will want to rest and clean up after your journey," Maria said. "I will bring you water for washing. Dinner is at 6. Left alone, Grace explored her room. It was simply furnished but comfortable, with a large bed, a wardrobe, and a rocking chair by the window. She could see the mountains in the distance and hear the creek burbling below. It was beautiful and peaceful, and she felt something in her chest loosen. After washing and changing into her good dress, Grace ventured downstairs. The main house was larger than she'd expected, with a big main room that served as both kitchen and living area, a separate dining room, and what looked like an office. The furniture was rough-hewn but solid, built for comfort rather than show. Frank found her examining the books on a shelf. "You like to read?" She turned. He'd cleaned up too, wearing fresh clothes and looking almost nervous. "I do. You have quite a collection." "My mother's influence. She believed a man should be able to discuss something besides cattle and weather." He gestured around. "So, what do you think?" "It is wonderful. The valley, the house, all of it. You have built something extraordinary here. It is missing something, though." He stepped closer. "It is missing the sound of children playing. It is missing the warmth of a wife's presence. It is missing a future." Grace's heart was racing. "Frank, I know I said I would give you time. I know I promised not to pressure you, and I will keep that promise. But I want you to know what I am hoping for. I am hoping you will decide to stay. I am hoping you will agree to marry me and build a life here together. I am hoping we can fill this house with love and laughter, and all the things I have dreamed about but never thought I would find." Before Grace could respond, Maria called them for dinner. The meal was delicious and lively, with Tom and several of the ranch hands joining them. The men were respectful and welcoming, clearly curious about Grace but too polite to ask direct questions. After dinner, Frank took her on a walk around the property. He showed her the barn where the horses were kept, the chicken coop, the garden that Maria tended. They ended at a fenced pasture where several horses grazed in the fading light. "This is what I want to expand," he said. "I have been breeding a few horses, trying to develop a line that is hardy enough for mountain work, but with good temperament and intelligence. It is slow going, but I think in a few years we could have something really special." Grace leaned on the fence, watching the horses. "Have you ever thought about breeding them specifically for women riders? Most horses are chosen and trained with men in mind, but there is a growing need for good horses suited to lady riders." Frank looked at her with surprise and admiration. "That is brilliant. I had not thought of that angle, but you are absolutely right. The market would be smaller but more specialized." He laughed. "See, this is what I need. Someone who sees things from a different perspective." They walked back to the house as stars began to appear. At the porch steps, Frank stopped and took her hand. "I meant what I said earlier. I want you to stay, but I do not want you to feel pressured. Take the time you need to decide. Get to know the place, the people, the life. Then make your choice with full knowledge of what you would be choosing." Grace squeezed his hand. "Thank you for understanding. Always." The next few days fell into a comfortable rhythm. Grace helped Maria with household tasks in the mornings, learning the rhythms of ranch life. She discovered she enjoyed the work, the sense of contributing to something larger than herself. In the afternoons, Frank would take her riding, showing her different parts of the ranch, teaching her about cattle management and horse breeding. The ranch hands gradually warmed to her presence, especially when she began helping Maria prepare meals and proved she was not afraid of hard work. Tom's approval was slower in coming, but Grace sensed he was protective of Frank and wanted to be sure her intentions were genuine. One afternoon, she found herself in the barn alone with Tom as she was learning to groom a horse properly. "Frank is a good man," Tom said without preamble. "Best I have ever known. He saved this ranch from bankruptcy, treated me and the men fair when other outfits were cutting wages. He deserves happiness." "I agree," Grace said quietly. "He is falling hard for you, maybe already fallen. I just want to make sure you feel the same way." Grace paused in her grooming, meeting Tom's direct gaze. "I did not come here looking for this. A week ago, I was stranded in Montrose with no money and no prospects. Frank helped me out of kindness, expecting nothing in return. I told myself I should not develop feelings for him, that it was too fast, too improbable, but I cannot help how I feel." "And how is that?" "I love him," she said simply. "I love his kindness and his integrity. I love how he treats people, how he talks about this place, how he makes me feel safe and valued. I love that he wants a partner, not a possession. And yes, I will marry him if he asks properly." Tom's weathered face split into a grin. "Well then, I reckon that is all I needed to hear." He tipped his hat. "Welcome to the family, Miss Norton." That evening, Frank invited her to ride out to his favorite spot on the ranch, a promontory that overlooked the entire valley. They arrived just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in impossible shades of pink and gold. "I come here when I need to think," Frank said, helping her dismount. "Or when I need to remember why I work so hard to keep this place going." They sat on a flat rock, watching the light fade from the sky. Grace felt peaceful in a way she never had before, as though she had finally found the place she was meant to be. "I spoke with Tom today," she said. "Did you now?" There was amusement in Frank's voice. "I suppose he gave you the protective older brother speech. Something like that." "I told him I was going to marry you." Frank went very still. "You did?" Grace turned to face him, taking both his hands in hers. "Frank Oliver, I know we have only known each other 2 weeks. I know this is impractical and impulsive and probably foolish. But I also know that I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you. I want to build a life with you here on this ranch. I want to wake up every morning to that view of the mountains and know I am home. So yes, if you are asking, my answer is yes." Frank let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for days. "I am asking, Grace Norton, will you marry me? Will you be my wife, my partner, my best friend? Will you help me turn this house into a home and build a future together?" "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes to all of it." He kissed her then, a kiss full of joy and promise and love. When they finally pulled apart, both were grinning like fools. "I do not have a ring," Frank said. "I should have planned better. I should have. I do not need a ring right now. I need you, and I have that." "You will have a ring, the best I can buy, and a proper wedding, whatever you want. I just want to start our life together. Everything else is details." They rode back to the ranch in the gathering darkness, hands linked whenever the trail allowed. When they arrived, Maria took one look at their faces and let out a whoop of joy that brought everyone running. "They are engaged," she announced, pulling Grace into a hug. "I knew it the moment I saw them together." The ranch hands clapped Frank on the back and offered congratulations. Tom produced a bottle of whiskey he had been saving for a special occasion, and they all toasted the happy couple. It was a simple celebration, but it filled Grace's heart with warmth. These people, who had been strangers 2 weeks ago, were now her family. Later, after the excitement had died down and the hands had returned to the bunkhouse, Grace sat with Frank on the porch swing, her head resting on his shoulder. "When should we get married?" he asked, his arm around her waist. "Soon. I do not want to wait. Is that terribly improper of me?" "No. I feel the same way." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "There is a circuit preacher who comes through the area once a month. He is due in about 2 weeks. We could be married then, if that suits you." 2 weeks, Grace said, testing the idea. "That gives us time to prepare, but not so much time that I will lose my nerve." "Are you nervous?" "A little. Not about marrying you, but about being a wife. I have never run a household like this before. What if I am terrible at it? You will be wonderful at it. And Maria will help, and you will figure it out as you go. We will figure it out together." 2 weeks passed in a flurry of preparation. Grace and Maria cleaned the house from top to bottom and sewed new curtains for the main rooms. Tom and the hands built a new shed and repaired the paddock fence. Frank made a quick trip to Denver and returned with a gold band for Grace and a new dress for the wedding, simple but beautiful in cream-colored silk. The day before the wedding, Charlie and Martha Henderson arrived with a wagon full of supplies for the celebration. Martha had baked a cake, and Charlie had brought several bottles of good whiskey. Other neighboring ranchers and their families began arriving, and Grace was touched by how many people had come to celebrate their union. The circuit preacher, Reverend Thomas, was a jovial man with a booming voice and a kind heart. He met with Frank and Grace the night before the ceremony, talking to them about the responsibilities of marriage and the importance of building a life on faith and mutual respect. "Marriage is a partnership," he told them. "You will face hardships together: drought, disease, financial troubles, personal losses. What will sustain you through all of that is the love and respect you have for each other. Never forget that you are on the same team, working toward the same goals." Grace woke on her wedding day to a perfect September morning, the air crisp and clear. Maria helped her dress, arranging her hair and pinning a small wreath of wildflowers to her head. "You look beautiful," Maria said, her eyes misty. "Frank is a lucky man." "I am the lucky one," Grace replied. "A month ago I had nothing. Now I have everything." The ceremony was held outside with the mountains as a backdrop. Grace walked down an aisle formed by the assembled guests, her eyes locked on Frank waiting at the end. He looked handsome and nervous in his best suit, his face lighting up when he saw her. Reverend Thomas performed a simple but moving ceremony. Frank's hands were steady as he slipped the gold band onto Grace's finger, and his voice was strong as he made his vows. Grace's hands trembled slightly, but her voice was clear as she promised to love, honor, and cherish him for the rest of her life. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Thomas declared. "Frank, you may kiss your bride." Frank cupped Grace's face gently and kissed her, and the assembled crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Grace felt tears of joy streaming down her face as she clung to her new husband. The celebration lasted into the evening. There was music and dancing, with Charlie producing a fiddle and playing lively tunes. Grace danced first with Frank, then with Tom, then with Charlie and several of the ranch hands. Martha's cake was delicious, and the whiskey flowed freely. As the stars came out, the guests began departing, some to camp nearby and others to head home. Frank and Grace stood on the porch, waving goodbye and accepting final congratulations. Finally, they were alone. Maria had discreetly retired to her own quarters, and the ranch was quiet except for the sounds of night birds in the creek below. Frank took Grace's hand. "Ready to start our life together, Mrs. Oliver?" Grace smiled at the sound of her new name. "I am ready." He led her upstairs to the room they would now share. It had been transformed during the day, with fresh flowers on the dresser and new linens on the bed. A fire crackled in the small fireplace, taking the chill off the mountain night. Frank closed the door behind them and pulled Grace into his arms. "I love you," he said softly. "I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me." "I could never regret it," Grace replied, reaching up to cup his face. "You saved me, Frank. Not just from being stranded in Montrose, but from a life of loneliness and fear. You showed me what it means to be truly loved. You saved me too. This ranch was just a business, a way to fill my days. You have made it a home." They kissed, a long, deep kiss that led to more kisses, and eventually to the consummation of their marriage. Grace, innocent and nervous, found Frank to be a patient and tender husband. He made love to her gently, whispering words of love and encouragement, making sure she felt cherished and safe. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the big bed, Grace's head on Frank's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Are you happy?" he asked, his fingers trailing through her hair. "Happier than I ever thought possible." "Good. That is all I ever want, to make you happy." Grace tilted her head to look at him. "And you, are you happy?" "Beyond measure. I feel like the luckiest man alive." They fell asleep in each other's arms, and Grace dreamed of a future full of love and possibility. The first months of marriage were an adjustment for both of them. Grace had to learn the rhythms of ranch life, the endless cycle of chores and responsibilities that kept the operation running. There were times when she felt overwhelmed, when the vastness of the land and the harshness of the work seemed too much. But Frank was always there, patient and encouraging, helping her learn while never making her feel inadequate. She discovered she had a talent for managing the household accounts, organizing the supplies, and planning for the future. Frank came to rely on her judgment, discussing major decisions with her and valuing her input. They truly were partners in every sense of the word. Winter came early and hard that year. Snow piled high in the valley, and the work became more difficult as they struggled to keep the cattle fed and the pipes from freezing. But the hardship brought its own kind of beauty. Grace had never seen anything more magical than the ranch blanketed in snow, with icicles hanging from the eaves and the creek frozen into fantastic shapes. On Christmas Eve, Frank presented her with a gift, a beautiful leather-bound journal. "For recording your thoughts or recipes or whatever you want. I thought you might like to document our life together." Grace was touched by his thoughtfulness. That night, by the light of the fire, she made her first entry. "It has been 3 months since I became Mrs. Frank Oliver, and I can scarcely believe how much my life has changed. I went from having nothing and no one to having everything I could ever want. Frank is the most wonderful husband a woman could ask for, kind, patient, hardworking, and deeply loving. Every day I fall more in love with him and with this life we are building together. If the stranded, frightened woman I was in Montrose could see me now, I do not think she would recognize herself. I am home. I am loved. I am happy." Winter gradually gave way to spring. The snow melted, revealing meadows full of wildflowers. The cattle that had survived the winter were driven to higher pastures, and there was a new crop of calves to care for. Grace discovered she enjoyed working with the animals, especially the horses. One day in late April, Maria found Grace in the kitchen, looking pale and queasy. "How long?" Maria asked knowingly. "How long what?" "How long since your last monthly?" Grace felt her face flush. I have been so busy I had not really noticed. Maybe 2 months," Maria smiled. I think you need to tell Frank he is going to be a father." The news sent Grace into a tailspin of emotions. Joy, certainly, but also fear. What if something went wrong? What if she was not a good mother? What if the baby did not survive the harsh conditions of ranch life? Frank's reaction was pure, uncomplicated joy. He swept her into his arms, spinning her around until she laughingly begged him to stop. "We are going to have a baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "A son or daughter, our child." "Are you not worried?" Grace asked. "Of course I am worried. But I am also thrilled. You are going to be a wonderful mother, Grace, and we will face whatever comes together, like we always do." The pregnancy was not easy. Grace suffered from terrible morning sickness for the first few months, and the summer heat was oppressive in her condition. But Frank was attentive and patient, taking on extra chores to lighten her load and ensuring she got plenty of rest. As her belly swelled, Grace found herself nesting, organizing and reorganizing the house, sewing tiny clothes, and preparing a nursery in one of the spare rooms. Frank built a beautiful cradle from pine wood, sanding it until it was silky smooth, with no rough edges that could hurt delicate baby skin. In late November, as the first snows began to fall, Grace went into labor. Martha Henderson had arrived a week earlier to help with the birth, and Maria stood by with supplies and warm water. Frank paced outside the bedroom, looking haggard with worry. The labor was long and difficult. Grace had never experienced such pain, and there were moments when she was certain she could not endure another minute. But Martha and Maria coached her through it, and finally, after 18 hours, a baby's cry filled the room. "It is a boy," Martha announced. "A healthy, beautiful boy." Frank burst into the room, tears streaming down his face. He knelt beside the bed where Grace lay exhausted, holding their son. "He is perfect," Frank whispered. "You are perfect. Thank you, Grace. Thank you for this gift." They named him James Thomas Oliver, after Frank's father and Tom, the foreman who had become like family. Little James had his father's dark hair and his mother's brown eyes, and from the moment he drew breath, he owned both his parents' hearts completely. The first few months with a newborn were exhausting. James was a fussy baby, demanding constant attention. Grace, still recovering from the difficult birth, struggled to keep up with the demands of both the household and the baby. There were nights when she sobbed from sheer exhaustion, feeling like a failure. But Frank never wavered in his support. He would take the baby in the middle of the night when James was inconsolable, walking the floor for hours to let Grace sleep. He praised her constantly, telling her what a wonderful mother she was, how strong and capable. Slowly, as James settled into a routine and Grace regained her strength, life found a new equilibrium. By the time James was 6 months old, Grace had regained her confidence. She loved being a mother, loved watching her son discover the world around him. Frank was a devoted father, spending every spare moment with his son, already dreaming of teaching him to ride and work the ranch. The years that followed were full and rich. James grew into a robust toddler, fearless and curious about everything. When he was 2, Grace discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, and the birth, while still painful, was quicker. They welcomed a daughter, Elizabeth Margaret Oliver, named for Frank's mother and Grace's deceased aunt. Elizabeth was a calm, easy baby, the opposite of her brother in temperament. She would lie in her cradle for hours, watching the world with serious, thoughtful eyes. James adored his little sister, constantly wanting to help care for her. The ranch continued to prosper. Frank's breeding program for horses was beginning to pay off, with buyers specifically seeking out 00 horses for their intelligence and temperament. Grace's idea about breeding horses for lady riders had proven particularly successful. and they had developed a small but loyal clientele of wealthy women seeking well-mannered mounts. Grace had also started a small school on the ranch, teaching not only her own children but also the children of neighboring ranchers and their hired hands. It started informally, with just a few students gathering in the main house a few times a week. But word spread, and soon Grace had a dozen regular pupils. Frank built her a small schoolhouse near the main house, and Grace finally fulfilled her dream of being a teacher on her own terms. When Elizabeth was 3 and James was 5, Grace found herself pregnant again. This child, another boy they named William Charles, was born during a spring thunderstorm, as if announcing from the start that he would be a force of nature. William had his father's gray-blue eyes and his mother's stubborn determination. 3 children kept Grace busy from dawn to dusk, but she had never been happier. The house that had once been silent and empty was now filled with laughter, tears, arguments, and love. Frank thrived on fatherhood, somehow finding time between managing the ranch to play with his children, teach them about the land and animals, and instill in them the values of hard work and integrity. Tom eventually retired from his position as foreman, though he stayed on the ranch in a small cabin Frank built for him, helping out when needed and serving as a beloved grandfather figure to the children. Maria remained the heart of the household, helping Grace manage the chaos of 3 young children while maintaining her own quarters and independence. One evening, after putting the children to bed, Grace and Frank sat on the porch swing, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. It was a ritual they had maintained throughout their marriage, this quiet time together at the end of the day. "You ever think about that day in Montrose?" Frank asked, his arm around Grace's shoulders. "Sometimes. It feels like a lifetime ago. Do you ever regret getting on that stagecoach?" Trusting a stranger, Grace looked up at her husband, at the face that had become more dear to her than her own. "Not for a single moment. Best decision I ever made. Even with 3 wild children and a ranch to run and never a moment's peace. Especially because of all that. This is the life I was meant to have, Frank. You are the man I was meant to find. Everything that came before was just leading me to that moment in Montrose when you decided to help a stranded woman." Frank pressed a kiss to her forehead. "I am the one who was blessed. You turned a house into a home, a ranch into a legacy. You gave me love, children, purpose beyond just working the land. I was existing before you. Now I am living." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the ranch they had built together. Inside the house, they could hear Maria humming as she finished cleaning up the kitchen. From upstairs came the faint sound of William crying out in his sleep, then settling again. "We should think about adding onto the house," Frank said. "The children are growing and they will need more space eventually." "I was thinking the same thing. Maybe we could add a proper parlor and another bedroom or 2. Whatever you want. This is your home as much as mine. More, probably, since you are the one who made it a home in the first place." Grace smiled. She thought about the frightened, desperate woman she had been 7 years ago, standing in a dusty street with 23 cents and no prospects. That woman would scarcely recognize the confident, capable person she had become. She had found not just security but genuine happiness. She had found not just a husband but a true partner. She had found not just shelter but home. "I love you," she said simply. "I love you too. Always have. From the moment I saw you standing in that street looking fierce and scared. Always will until the day I die and beyond." The years continued to pass in a rhythm of seasons and celebrations. The children grew, each developing their own personalities and interests. James, the eldest, was serious and responsible, already showing an aptitude for ranch management that made Frank proud. Elizabeth was creative and gentle, with a talent for art and music that Grace encouraged by ordering books and materials from back east. William was the wild one, fearless and adventurous, constantly getting into scrapes and coming home with torn clothes and stories of near disasters. When James turned 12, Frank began teaching him the business side of ranching, taking him along on trips to Denver to meet with buyers and learn about negotiating contracts. Grace watched her eldest son mature, seeing so much of Frank in his steady, thoughtful demeanor. Elizabeth at 10 was already teaching the younger children in Grace's school, showing a natural ability with education that reminded Grace of herself at that age. Grace began to dream of Elizabeth perhaps becoming a real teacher one day, maybe even opening a proper school in Denver or another growing city. William, at 8, was happiest outdoors. He could ride better than children twice his age, and he had a special affinity for horses that even Frank acknowledged was unusual. "He will be our master horse trainer someday," Frank predicted. "Mark my words." Grace's school had grown until she had nearly 20 students ranging in age from 5 to 15. She had organized them into grade levels and was teaching everything from basic reading and arithmetic to history and science. Frank had expanded the schoolhouse twice, and there was talk in the community of making it an official school district with Grace as the teacher. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Frank took Grace to Denver for a week, leaving the children in Maria's capable care. It was the first time they had been alone together since before James was born, and it felt like a second honeymoon. They stayed at the Windsor Hotel, attended the theater, and dined at fancy restaurants. But what Grace treasured most were the quiet conversations, the walks through the city, the chance to reconnect as husband and wife rather than just as parents and ranching partners. 10 years, Frank said one evening as they prepared for bed. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday, sometimes like forever." "Both," Grace agreed. "I can barely remember my life before you, but I also feel like I have known you my entire life." "Do you have any regrets? Anything you wish had been different?" Grace thought about it seriously. Their life had not always been easy. There had been hard winters, sick animals, financial worries, and the constant challenges of raising children and managing a ranch. But through it all, they had faced everything together. "None," she said firmly. "Not a single one. You. Only that I did not meet you sooner. Think of all the years we could have had together. We have the years we are meant to have, and we will make the most of every one of them." They did make the most of their years. As the children grew older and more independent, Frank and Grace found new projects to tackle together. They expanded the horse breeding program, adding new bloodlines and developing a reputation for quality that extended beyond Colorado. Grace's school continued to thrive, and eventually, the community did establish it as an official district, with Grace as the head teacher and 2 assistant teachers hired to help manage the growing enrollment. When James turned 18, Frank officially made him a partner in the ranch. It was a proud moment, watching their son sign the papers that gave him part ownership in the 00. James had earned it, working as hard as any of the hired hands and showing sound judgment in his decisions. Elizabeth announced at 16 that she wanted to attend a teacher's college in Denver. It meant 2 years away from the ranch, but Grace and Frank supported her ambitions. She had inherited her mother's love of learning and teaching, and they wanted her to have every opportunity to pursue her dreams. William, at 14, was already showing signs of the man he would become. Tall and strong like his father, with his mother's quick mind and stubborn determination, he had the makings of an excellent rancher. But he was also wild and reckless, constantly testing boundaries and taking unnecessary risks that gave Grace gray hairs. One evening, after William had come home with a broken arm from attempting to break an untrainable horse, Grace sat with Frank on their porch, worry etched on her face. "He is so much like you," she said. "Fearless to the point of recklessness. He will learn," Frank assured her. "I did some foolish things at his age, too. He needs to test himself, figure out his limits. He will be all right." "And if he is not, if one of these stunts kills him," Frank pulled her close. "We raised him to be strong and capable. We taught him everything we could. Now we have to trust that it was enough. We have to let him make his own mistakes and learn from them." It was hard advice to follow, but Grace tried. Watching your children grow up and face the world on their own was perhaps the hardest part of parenting, harder even than the sleepless nights of infancy or the challenges of teaching them right from wrong. The years continued their steady march. Elizabeth graduated from Teachers College and returned to the ranch to teach at her mother's school, while also teaching music lessons on the side. She had blossomed into a beautiful, confident young woman, and Grace watched with amusement as several young men from neighboring ranches suddenly found reasons to visit the Double O. James married at 22, choosing a sensible, hardworking woman named Sarah from a nearby ranch. The wedding was a grand affair, with half the territory in attendance. Grace wept with joy watching her eldest son begin his own life, seeing the clear love between him and his bride. William, surprisingly, was the next to marry. At 20, he met a girl named Catherine at a horse auction in Denver. She was the daughter of a wealthy horse breeder, beautiful and spirited, and William fell hard and fast. They were married within 6 months, and Catherine proved to be exactly what William needed. Someone who could match his energy and passion while also grounding him when his impulsiveness threatened to get him into trouble. Elizabeth took her time, turning down several proposals before finally accepting the suit of a young lawyer named Robert who appreciated her intelligence and independence. They married when she was 24, and she continued teaching even after marriage, a modern woman forging her own path. Grace and Frank watched their children build their own lives with pride and satisfaction. The ranch had expanded to include homes for both James and William's families, creating a small compound of Oliver households. Elizabeth and Robert lived in Denver but visited frequently, and the extended family gathered often for dinners and celebrations. Then came the grandchildren. James and Sarah had 3 children in quick succession, filling the ranch with new life and energy. William and Catherine had twins, a boy and a girl who were as wild and fearless as their father. Elizabeth and Robert had a daughter, quiet and bookish, who spent her visits with her nose buried in books. Grace, now a grandmother at 45, found herself busier than ever. There were always grandchildren underfoot, always someone needing attention or comfort or education. She loved every chaotic moment of it. Frank, silver threading through his dark hair, had slowed down slightly but still rose before dawn to work the ranch. He was training the grandchildren now, teaching them the same lessons he had taught his own children about the land, the animals, and the importance of hard work and integrity. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Grace counted their blessings. 3 children, all happily married. 8 grandchildren, healthy and thriving. A ranch that had grown beyond Frank's wildest dreams. A legacy that would continue for generations. "Remember when you paid my passage to Denver?" Grace asked softly. "Best $15 I ever spent," Frank replied immediately. 20. You paid 20. Worth every penny and more. He took her hand, his grip still strong despite his age. "I got everything I ever wanted because you got on that stagecoach." "We got everything we wanted," Grace corrected. Together, they sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, watching another day end on the ranch they had built together. The sounds of family surrounded them. Grandchildren playing in the yard, their children's voices calling them inside for supper. Maria singing in the kitchen as she prepared one of her famous meals. Grace thought about the journey that had brought her here, from desperate and stranded to fulfilled and surrounded by love. Every hardship, every challenge, every moment of doubt had been worth it to arrive at this place, this life, this profound contentment. "I love you," she said, "not for the first time, not for the last." "I love you too," Frank replied, pressing a kiss to her hand. "Thank you for taking a chance on a stranger with a kind gesture. Thank you for being the kind of man worth taking a chance on." As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Grace and Frank rose and walked hand in hand into their home, into the warmth and chaos and love that filled every corner. They had built something extraordinary together, a life rich with meaning and connection, a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. And it had all started with a simple act of kindness in a dusty street in Montrose, Colorado, when a rancher saw a woman in need and decided to help. From that moment, everything had changed for both of them, setting in motion a love story that had grown and deepened over the decades, weathering every storm and celebrating every triumph together. They had found each other at exactly the right moment when both were ready for something more, something better. And they had built that better life together, brick by brick, day by day, year by year. It was a life well lived, a love well earned, a journey well traveled. And as they settled into their comfortable chairs by the fire, surrounded by family and filled with gratitude, both knew that if they had it to do over again, they would not change a single thing. Every choice, every sacrifice, every moment of doubt had led them here, to this perfect, imperfect, absolutely beautiful life they had created together. The fire crackled, the family laughed and talked around them, and Grace and Frank simply held hands and smiled, knowing they were exactly where they were meant to be, with exactly who they were meant to be with. It was enough. It was everything. It was home.